Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Arthur Caplan, who is a renowned bioethicist. He's also founding head of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine in New York City. Today, we're talking abortion, end-of-life issues, FDA drug approvals, climate change, climate justice, gun control, and so much more. So please stay tuned. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Arthur Caplan, who is the Drs. William F. and Virginia Connolly Mitty Professor and founding head of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine in New York City. Prior to coming to New York or to NYU, Dr. Caplan was the Sidney D. Caplan Professor of Bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine in Philadelphia, where he created the Center for Bioethics and the Department of Medical Ethics. He is author or editor of 35 books and more than 800 papers in peer-reviewed journals. He's served on a number of national and international committees. He is a regular commenter on bioethics and healthcare issues. He's also the recipient of many awards and honors, too many to even include in this intro. But he also holds 7 honorary degrees from colleges and medical schools. And I will mention of note, when I was researching Dr. Caplan for this interview, some interesting background information. He also was integral to founding the National Marrow Donor Program, which led to National Organ Transplant Act of 1984, which also discussed how organs are distributed. He's a big proponent of vaccinations and got heavily involved with that, obviously, in 2019 and 20 for COVID. He's a proponent of stem cell research, and he's been involved in things like securing an apology from the head of HHS, which is the Health and Human Services in the United States, in 1991 regarding the Tuskegee syphilis study, as well as the German Medical Association had an apology from the German Medical Association for their role of the German physicians in the Holocaust and some of the atrocities there. So very, very interesting gentleman, very illustrious career. Thank you so much, Dr. Caplan, I was about to call you Dr. Cohen, Dr. Caplan, for your time and for sharing with us your thoughts and some of your really interesting opinions. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's jump right in because I have tons of questions. But let's start with, I guess the best thing to start with would be, what is a bioethicist? Can you give us just sort of a general idea of what you do?
Well, look, Aly, for many, many eons, doctors have had ethical codes, all the way back to Hippocrates. We all have heard of the Hippocratic Oath that many doctors still take at graduation, although modified a little bit from what Hippocrates was doing. So ethics has always been around medicine. Particularly in the 19th century, a lot of discussions of ethical duties of doctors, but it was more, I'm going to call it codes of professionalism and conduct. Wear a tie if you're a man. In the 19th century, they all were men. Make sure you treat your colleagues for free, a bunch of other comments and guidance about how to behave. But in the 1960s, 1970s, a number of new technologies popped into medicine. Think of the creation of the intensive care unit. Think of the creation of the first ventilators, first heart-lung bypass machine. These raised all kinds of questions about who should get them. I can remember when I was back at Columbia Medical School, we only had, say in 1979, 1980, 6 dialysis machines for New York City. So the question was, who's getting them? It wasn't a medical question completely, obviously partly because you didn't want to give it to people who wouldn't benefit, but it was partly age, social position, can they pay, these kinds of questions. And doctors began to say, we need some help in deciding when to shut off machines that are keeping somebody technically alive, in deciding who's going to get a scarce kidney transplant as it just came online, whether we should try to make babies outside the body, first in vitro fertilization. That became bioethics, and that's what I do. It's often technology driven, Sometimes it's driven by resource constraints when we look at issues in other countries, poor countries, who gets care, what's good enough. And so I run a program at NYU where I've been 10 years now that has teaching for med students that's mandatory. All 4 years, we look at all kinds of issues: privacy, confidentiality, informed consent, what to do with a difficult patient, these kinds of things. And we also teach a master's degree in bioethics, which is kind of the license now to become a bioethicist if you have that master's. So NYU and many schools have master's programs. We have about 20 students a year there. And we do research projects. We study how well do people understand vaccines when they give consent. Do they know what the risk-benefit issues are? We might get into studying whether people benefit from having mandates of vaccines, or do they resist them and just not follow through? So there's a lot of empirical work. My division has probably 8 professors in it now, 4 of whom are more social science, 4 of whom are more philosophical ethics. So it's a fun area. It never gets boring. Always got something lively going on.
Yeah, no.
For example, at NYU, we're doing face transplants. We're studying pig transplants. We're waking up dead people to see if it can resuscitate. I mean, that's just the past year.
Yeah, no, I mean, even we had to cancel our interview for some weather issues. And even within the last 2 weeks, I thought to myself, oh my God, look at all the news that has just even popped up in the last 2 weeks. Look at the number of gun injuries and shootings. And it's just remarkable how
we got boosters approved every week. There seems
trigger
to be
laws for abortions.
Yes.
So we have a lot to talk about. But it's interesting now. When I was also looking at some of a variety of work that you've done for decades now, you have an opinion. It's not like you're acting as a journalist, or the way I guess journalists should really be. We should be bipartisan or biased. You actually have an opinion, which maybe gets you in trouble, doesn't get you in trouble. Tell me a little bit about how that's gone as your position.
Well, a couple of things about my career. I always believed that there was no point in just keeping bioethics academic. I mean, there are peers of mine, friends of mine, who just write for each other and sort of debate and go home as professors and publish some of what they want to say in a journal. I always thought the whole point was to get out in the public, to try and shape policy. If you want to, say, improve patient welfare or help a doctor make a decision, then you've got to really be out there in the public arena. So I will confess, I dragged our field, not everybody in it, but a good number of people into public debate, public discussion, comment on current affairs, work with legislators, work with patient advocacy groups, work with politicians. If you're going to do that, they don't like two-handed ethicists. They like answers.
Right.
So there, you're going to have to sometimes take a stance, sometimes maybe an unpopular stance. I certainly have had my experience of that. You're going to get flack from people who don't agree with you. I've had my share of nasty emails, death threats, insults, whatever. That goes with the territory. So I don't care. I think, again, we've done some good things in bioethics. I've had a chance to shape thinking, change thinking, institute policies in many areas. As you were pointing out, I helped create that National Marrow Donor Program, which saved a lot of lives. I helped come up with the policies to distribute organs for transplant in this country, put in a law that made families get asked about whether they wanted to be organ donors. You don't have to, but you should be given the chance. And I won't bore you with others, but those are areas where you're taking a stance and you're saying this is the way to move. And people sometimes say to me, you ever been wrong? Yes. I've changed my mind in print over time. I started out, I'll give you an example. Oregon was the first state to approve physician aid in dying, or medical aid in dying, as we call it.
Euthanasia. Yeah.
And I initially opposed that. I thought there's going to be too much abuse. People will be bullied into saying, I got to go now because they're too expensive or their family doesn't want to take care of them anymore. The data didn't bear that out. It looks like people are not being rushed off. They choose when they're in the final stages, usually of cancer deaths, not to go through hospice. They don't want palliative care. They just want to leave. So I've come around and been more supportive of that from being an initial critic. Sometimes the data, the evidence, you got to pay attention and say, I had a good idea, just didn't work. Or I've been an opponent of something and my grounds for opposing it are wrong. There isn't something bad happening or some bad outcomes. So I'll wrap that up by saying it's interesting to try and operate in the public arena as an ethicist. Why? Because everybody thinks they're an ethicist. Everybody's got a value opinion, a moral opinion. You can't really come in and say, well, I've studied this for 40 years and I can tell you what you ought to be doing. You have to persuade them. They won't just say, oh, okay. If you're a doctor, you go in and you say, you've got a polyp on your colon from a colonoscopy. I think I better come out. And people are going to say, well, I don't know. You really think so? Blah, blah, blah. That's not ethics.
Yeah, I mean, you're almost like a politician in many ways because you really are pulling, you're making a case. You're a lawyer, you're a politician, you're kind of all wrapped in one. You're a scientist because you have to understand the scientific basis, maybe the biology, obviously.
Religious views come in. What do they think?
Right.
So the other interesting angle of doing the ethics as a bioethicist out partly in the public arena. I don't want to say that's all I do. I have my medical school jobs, but I think you also learn that you need to be aware of your critics. You have to understand where they're coming from. I happen to be a pro-choice defender of the right to choose an abortion, but I understand the other side. Being pro-life is hardly a bad moral stance. You want to protect fetal life or potential life or innocent life. Okay, that's not the worst moral sentiment I ever heard. It's a trade-off. In a lot of ethics fights, you have to trade off. You have to balance. You have to sort of come down on a close call. But it's not like I don't go around saying the other side is just ridiculous or stupid. I think I'll give you another example. Parents who don't want to vaccinate their kids, they're trying to look out for their kids. They want to protect them. They're not trying to do something hostile. I think they're doing something wrong and not borne out by evidence. But I understand that they're worried that vaccines might hurt their kids and they don't want to take those risks. So in debating things, hopefully, I'm trying to show others you don't have to assault the other side. You can respect your critic or someone who differs with you without getting personal or abusive.
So you think you've gotten, I would say, more open-minded as your career has evolved, or do you feel like you've already started off in this kind of, let's hear everyone's opinion and let's really formulate it? In other words, time has made things change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think anybody ever asked me that. I think I've gotten more open-minded. When I started out, I used to be pretty sure when I made the argument, this is the way to go. I'll give you an example of this. In neonatology, there's a lot of discussion about when should we push hard to rescue a preemie baby. They're often at 20 weeks, 21 weeks, pretty unlikely to do well because they don't have lungs, they're not formed, they're hard. We don't have technology to really oxygenate them well, and you can get a lot of disability or death. So I've had neonatology once tell me that a particular child was doomed and wouldn't make it and we ought to let them die. Parents didn't agree. Took the kid home. I think that kid was 24, 25 weeks, a little older. Did the best they could to take care of their kid, and the child turned out to be a happy and cognitively pretty solid young woman and enjoying her life. And it was humbling to me because I thought, this is not a situation we should savor. And because of the way the parents worked, to work with that kid, save that kid, educate that kid, do everything they could for that kid, they showed me that, it's not so clear sometimes what the outcomes are going to be if you're willing to work hard, devote yourself, take the risk. So over time, I've had some of those more humbling experiences. And as I think, that happens to doctors
Sure.
It's happened to me on the other end of just trying to predict what somebody's going to do, and then they don't do it, or you're guessing.
In medicine, you would almost argue this like personalized medicine, because you can create algorithms. You can have a whole host of general beliefs and thoughts, as we're taught in medical school, because, but then you have these individual cases that just throw everything on its head.
Right.
And that's when it changes your gestalt of the big picture. So it's kind of like this back and forth.
Exactly. I've been in a lot of the issues in bioethics around end-of-life care.
Mm-hmm.
So you're trying to predict what's going to happen to a dying 90-year-old. And, generally speaking, you kind of come in there medically and say, given 4 diseases, 90 years old, this isn't going to end well. We got to start preparing for failure. Right. Every once in a while, some 90-year-old just proves you wrong. They come out of the ICU or wherever they are, and you're sort of like, how did that happen? But it happens. And so you got to build it. I'm not saying it's wrong to say that's enough, and I don't care to come out with 4 diseases, but sometimes you're surprised by the facts. We can't always 100% predict, and I've learned that. That gets you a little more humble about saying with authority, this is it. She's going to be dead tomorrow by 9 a.m.
Yeah, like you wrote about the Terry Schiavo case, which I don't think our listeners could tell me a little bit briefly, because we have so much more I'd like to cover. But I'm fascinated. You wrote a book about it, and I want to hear what that case was and when that was.
Well, Schiavo was a young woman who wound up in a permanent coma, not dead, but permanently unconscious. Her brain suffered a lot of damage because she wound up not getting oxygen when she went in after a heart attack in the hospital. And her family was bitterly divided about what to do if she was never going to wake up. Her mom and her dad and her brother, and I think another sister, all said, keep her going. She is a religious Catholic. She would not want to be allowed to die. Her husband said, she'd never want to be this way. I know her better. I think we should take away her feeding tube. That's what was keeping her going, is artificially feeding her. It wasn't with a spoon, it was a tube. And the husband said, stop. And the nursing home where she was in Florida said, okay. And then the other side of the family went to court. And this became one of the landmark cases about who gets to decide, husband or mom and dad. And it went up through the Florida courts. Jeb Bush was then the governor. I think there were 7 Florida trials on this thing. The Florida legislature stepped in and said, you got to treat her. Then the Supreme Court got involved, and they said, you don't have to treat her, but Congress, including then President Bush and Bill Frist, some listeners may remember the senator from Tennessee who was the Senate Speaker, all said you got to treat her. Anyway, long story short, the courts finally established that the husband has the right to make decisions over the rest of the family, which I agree with. And I, early on, was one of his defenders. I can tell you that was pretty lonely for a while because people did not want to come in on his side. It was easier to say, keep her going and just leave her that way. But I think he was sincere. I think he felt he knew her best. I do think husbands or wives are close, and they, the parents hadn't lived with Terry Schiavo for 20 years. He knew her. And so I argued not that he could have decided the other way, but he knew her wishes the best. And that's sort of where we are to this day from that case.
Yeah, interesting. Really interesting, because I was young at the time, but I do remember that case. That was really kind of, when I read your bio. So, a couple things. We're going to move into topics briefly. Your childhood informed your job.
True.
And I am very curious for the audience, to hear it myself from you, but also for the audience to hear a little bit about your background and how it shaped you, because that plays a role in really your thoughts and opinions as you move forward. So tell us a little bit about your childhood.
I am so old that I actually was one of the last people in America who had polio. And that was a big event in my life, obviously, when I was 7. I grew up in Boston. I wound up at the Mass General, which I think was so long ago. I'm not even sure they had a children's wing then, but they were making them because there were so many kids that had polio. And listeners may not realize this, but polio is a horribly debilitating disease. It leads to paralysis of muscles as the virus gets into the muscles. They stop working. And if it gets into your diaphragm, which is the muscle that pumps air, allows your lungs to breathe, if you will, you can't breathe anymore. So that's death, unless you have some kind of machine. And we had a primitive thing called an iron lung, which was a pressurized thing. It sort of moved your chest using air pressure. Horrible. You were trapped in this giant.
It was a metal case. You can look at it online. It's pretty
full body
horrifying.
length case. I never had that. I was not in that thing, but I knew kids who were, and I knew when I was in the hospital where the floor was. So long story short, I was in the hospital probably 9 months, paralyzed neck, paralyzed legs, couldn't move, but it never attacked my muscles in my lungs, so I was able to breathe. No one knew what to do with polio. There were no treatments. They gave us heat packs, which is sort of a funny concept, but that's what they had at the time. So I spent a lot of hours with heat packs, and I had a lot of time to be thinking about things, so I noticed a few things. One, my parents could only stay 1 hour at that time, then out. And I believe visiting hours were 3 times a week. That seemed crazy because I wasn't going anywhere. There was no reason they couldn't have stayed more.
Was it an infectious reason at the time? I mean, did they think that there was some, because at that time there wasn't a vaccine.
There was no vaccine, and I don't think they thought so. I think they knew that it was transmitted by bad hygiene. So if you didn't touch anybody or drink from their water or exchange toothbrushes or something, you were okay. Still, I never saw my dog for 9 months. That bothered me a lot. It's like, no pets can come in here. They didn't tell us the truth. My docs, when a kid died, they just said they went home. Now, if you were in the bed next to the kid and watching him turn blue, you had a pretty good idea they didn't really go home. But they were afraid that we couldn't handle the grim information. We all could handle it. Well, I mean, I don't know if we could handle it, but we all knew it.
Without your parents, too. You know, here you are alone, you get that information. I mean, how do you process that?
And your parents come in and they're freaked out because they know that you got this potentially terminal disease.
They're not trained to, in psychology.
No. And we didn't have any psychologists, by the way, at the time. That wasn't even around. The people who were treating us were used to treating adults. It's not that there were no pediatricians, but the staff of a hospital would be light on pediatricians. So it really was formative for me because it got me thinking about truth-telling and your right to have visitors, and to what extent could I say, I don't want to do my homework, which somehow they managed to get to me no matter what. That was my parents' obsession that I not fall behind. So here I am paralyzed trying to do my
algebra, arithmetic,
that really got me thinking a lot about ethics, a lot about medicine, a lot about healthcare. I think it oriented me toward the ethics side or end of the street, that early experience. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I thought that was just a really, important piece of your whole puzzle of who you are, because it shapes you, and formative years. So, well, I'm glad you're doing well and that you got through that. I might as well touch on the fact that we now have polio in the water in New York, right?
I know, it's driving me
So how does
crazy.
that, I mean, geez,
It's
how many years later?
That vaccine works. You don't want polio. If you haven't vaccinated your kids, and there are counties in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, I'm in Connecticut, where the vaccination rates for polio are only around 65% for kids. You don't want to do that. The disease is floating around. Vaccinate your kids against polio. No risk from the kind of vaccine that we use here. Absolutely effective. You should just get it. You don't want that disease coming back. You can argue about whether every adult should go back and get it. I'm not sure every adult is sort of at high risk in the same way, but for children, absolutely.
Yeah, and by the way, I want to clarify, it was the wastewater treatment plant that found levels of it. It wasn't in the drinking water per se.
Correct.
But so I just want to clarify that for the audience, because I talk so much about drinking water and having its problems.
That's an interesting aspect of disease, we now do surveillance using wastewater. You sample it, you can see monkeypox, you can see COVID, you can see polio. That's
Right.
new, and that's very exciting. It helps us know whether there's an outbreak.
Well, it's also in my work, which is a lot of drinking water issues. Does that get washed off and cleaned off?
Sure.
Because this is a whole issue of, are we chlorinating enough? Are we protecting people from transit of that water to homes around the country, which serves 80% of our country is the wastewater treatment plant. So anyway,
we saw that explode this recently with the Jackson, Mississippi total breakdown of the water supply. So
correct.
That's very
Don't
dangerous.
get me started. I need a drink. It's 10 in the morning. Don't get me started. My kishkas. All right. So let's start with some topics that you said you threw out there. Let's start with abortion, because I don't want to miss
something
this.
Something controversial, something light, easy.
Well, you know, where are we now? Roe v. Wade, you know, it was a decision, not a law. I thought, you know, listen, I'm not a lawyer, and I want to, you know, really understand the details of this. You know, in 1973, it was under the Nixon administration, conservative Supreme Court justice system, and that was the passing of Roe v. Wade. Give me a little background on, at that point, why it was so supported, and then where, you know, people have had different opinions, different constitutional lawyers about religion playing a big role. Where are we now, and what are your thoughts on that? Because I know you have a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah, we could do the rest of this interview just on that. It's a big complicated topic. But way back in the day, I think the driving factors to have the court make a decision on the availability of abortion, one, the court had been articulating a notion of privacy. And what they meant by that was your right to make choices. Sometimes in ethics we call that autonomy. And the argument was that people have a right to decide what treatment they do or they don't want. And that might extend to reproductive choices. And lo and behold, it might even extend to women making their own choices about this, controlling their bodies. That's why you hear so much in the abortion debate about my body, my choice. That framework of personal choice was emerging and strong in the early 70s. So that ethic led the court to sort of say, look, if we're going to respect autonomy, this is one of these areas where the state shouldn't stop you from making a decision. You have to make a decision. They didn't say abortion was good. They didn't say everybody should always seek an abortion for any reason. They basically just said the woman has the right to make the choice. They didn't say you have to talk to your partner. They didn't say you have to talk to a committee. They didn't say you have to talk to the governor. They just said, as with all medical decisions, we're trying to give the competent, not a child or a mentally disabled person, but a competent adult, the right to choose. Remember, we were seeing that right to choose extend throughout medicine at that time. There were the right to know your diagnosis, the right to say, I want to stop medical treatment that I don't want. So it was part of that. Two other things were going on at that time. One was we began to see in the abortion debate unsafe abortions. So women were dying, getting so-called back alley, self-induced abortions, or going to crackpots, and it made women think we have to have safe abortion. So that began to emerge as a woman's right to choose to protect her health if she was going to go in that direction. Hold on a minute. I don't know what that was. I think the third key factor in the abortion debate was really the emergence of the women's movement. I mean, feminism began to arise. Women began to say, we're going to fight for this issue. If, you know, the old joke was if men were pregnant, abortion would be an ironclad right forever. Well, as women began to express themselves, organize, become a group that looked out for their interests, that was putting pressure on state legislatures and state courts to say, we want this right. So it wasn't really a debate about the morality of abortion. It was a debate about the morality of choice.
And autonomy and that relationship. And since that time, I guess the active three issues that I was thinking about were, You have the concept now of what is life, morally, medically, legally, politically. Then you have, is this all or none? Rape versus, is this a medical, like anencephaly, where a baby's born with neural tubes defects and trisomy 13 or 18 or spina bifida? Or also, is it the mother's life that's more valued than the fetal life? ACOG, the American College of Gynecology in this country, has always emphasized the mother's life over the fetal life. That's how they're trained.
And I'll jump in there and say, I believe that is morally correct. A full-fledged female adult, her interests and rights take precedence if her life is threatened over a potential person, someone who doesn't yet exist. So I think the moral equation there is very clear. You have to respect the rights of, let's call it a moral agent, a full-fledged moral person, over something that could become that, might be able to grow into that, but isn't that yet. So when I see threats of pregnancy to the health of the mother, I want laws that absolutely respect the right of the mother to say, I want to live, or doctors to say, we've got to make a choice.
Right.
We're going to save the mom. So on that one, I think the ethics is out of sync with where some of these state laws are that say, no, you have to save the fetus. I don't think that's correct. Where does life begin? It is true that every life begins at conception. However, it is not true that every conception begins a life. The failure rate of conception to birth is probably around 40%. 40%. Genetic errors, stillbirths, problems in development. So not every embryo is a person. That doesn't make any sense. If a large percentage, close to half, are not, then giving them rights or talking about them as persons from the moment of conception, to me, it's incoherent. When do they really become a life, so to speak? Well, we all know that in medicine, you declare people dead when their brain has lost its function. When the brain functions fully emerge, I think that probably is the start of the person, an independent person with not just brain cells, but a functioning brain. When does that happen? Probably around 24, 25 weeks, you could start to say that's when you've got something approaching a person. And that, to me, is probably the start of, interestingly enough, when you're going to maybe limit abortions, maybe no third trimester ones, unless the fetus does not have a functioning brain. As you pointed out, there sadly are a few that maldevelop and don't have that. But if you've got it, and that's why I think Roe versus Wade wasn't so crazy. It was trying to draw a line around viability, as they said. I think viability and personhood are today around 24 weeks. And to me, that decision was probably sound. States have run around in some parts of the U.S. and basically said, obsessed with embryos, we're going to treat them as people. If you do that, you wind up with crazy situations like tax deduction as soon as you're pregnant, driving in the high occupancy vehicle lane because you're two people if you're pregnant at 3 weeks. I mean, you can just go on and on with sort of the ridiculousness of trying to pretend that an embryo is a full-fledged person. I think that, I've argued this for many, many years. I don't think that's coherent. Is an embryo nothing? No. Probably has some moral, what we would call considerability. I don't think you should wear them as jewelry. And I said that deliberately. I think that is probably disrespectful. But do I want to say I'm equivalent to a one-day embryo in all rights? No.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of your points are excellent. I never really thought about, when you think of someone as brain dead, I mean, that's really putting the emphasis, because you would know, you've studied end-of-life issues for so many decades, to apply that to the beginning of life, because some people believe it's the heartbeat. It's not the brain.
I'm not so wound up about heartbeats. Remember Terry Schiavo, the case we discussed here, she had a heartbeat. She wasn't dead. Right. But I think most people would say, you just keep me alive with a beating heart and no brain, no mind, no sentience, no awareness, no nothing. I don't think so. I don't want to be that way.
Yeah, and as someone who, I will say as a female who has lots of friends who have had miscarriages because, people don't realize fertilization actually begins in the fallopian tubes. And
Right.
that's where all the ectopics happen. Not all of them, but a lot of them happen. So they don't even make their way to the uterus. They're not even given a home yet, And so I think people, many miscarriages start off, in the fallopian tubes. And there's some, a variety of issues that happen there. It doesn't even have to be a genetic, issue. It has to be a placement issue. So, thinking about that, also as a rheumatologist, I'll mention that I see higher rates of pregnancy complications in patients with lupus and patients with rheumatoid and patients with MS. And so all of those are a little subset of what do you do with all those states? In my opinion, I have to get this in there. All the states that are in the South that have a high proportion of minority women who have maybe a higher proportion of lupus or some of these other autoimmune diseases that tend to affect minorities more. What do you do with that?
Let's say you had a genetic disease, Tay-Sachs, or some severe disease, and you want to create embryos outside the body, test them, and use the ones that don't have the disease. In some states, you can't destroy the other embryos. Does that make any sense? You're going to preserve a child that is not viable?
Right. I mean, there's just so many iterations of things that I think people don't necessarily put thought into before these laws were actually, the trigger laws are now.
This is a reason why I think in areas like abortion, I don't really care what the exterminator, who's a state legislator in Alabama, thinks women ought to do. What I care about is what the woman thinks in consultation with her doctor and her family or partner. If she wants to have that dialogue too, great. But it really should be a pure ethics choice. And if you don't like abortion, then convince people not to do it with ethical arguments. But having these bans and laws, they're too crude. They're insensitive to all the differences that people experience. As we've said, some have birth defects, some have diseases that put them at high risk. Even using in vitro fertilization, if you want to have a baby, they make a lot more embryos so that you increase the chance of having a baby. You're going to stop that because you're not going to keep the unused embryos? That's as pro-life as you could be.
Yeah. And how about the economic issues? I mean, you're talking about also areas where people can't afford to have babies. Not that they're using it as, let's go party, get pregnant, and let's, this is so easy and fun. No abortion is easy. I don't know where people get that from. This is a highly emotional situation, no matter what way you look at it. But economically, what are your thoughts on that? Because many of these states have very poor, women.
Well, they also, pro-life people, many, tend to give up on the child as soon as it's born. So how about some postnatal care? How about some benefits programs? How about some food being sent? Formula? We didn't have baby formula in this country for the past year. You couldn't even get it. Yeah. You got to really make a push if you're pro-life to help poor women and women with overburden if they have 6 or 7 kids already, a single mom. So I certainly have had women say to me, I've had 6 children. I can't manage another kid and do right by the rest of my kids. Well, it may not be my choice to recommend an abortion if she's pregnant again, but I can understand that decision and respect it if she goes in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think all these are great points. And, I'm really glad you weighed into that. It's worrisome for other rights that I think, transgender, gay marriage, contraception issues.
Yeah.
It's almost a little bit of a slippery slope. We've heard about that as well as being a problem moving forward. What are your thoughts on that?
Let's call it what it is when you put these bans in on abortion. You are basically forcing women to carry pregnancies. And that is not respectful of their autonomy. You should not be taking away the right to choose what you're going to do with your body. I don't force people. I have a lot of folks I see at NYU, they need kidneys. I don't show up at Dr. Cohen's house and say, guess what? You got 2 pretty good kidneys. He needs one. I'm here to get yours because we have to save his life. You don't have any choice. As long as you have 2 kidneys, we're taking one. We don't do things to force people to make decisions to save others. So even if you think that the right thing to do is to save the fetus. We don't force it. We don't mandate that you have to do this.
What about vaccines, though, in the same breath that you just said that? Some people would argue you're forcing us to get vaccines.
Yeah. And there I would say we should mandate vaccination because then you're harming others. If you are just dealing with your own pregnancy and your own fetus, how you relate to that and make a decision, it's not going to kill anybody outside the two of you. So the burden, if you will, falls on you to decide you want to use your body to house and make safe and nourish this potential life. When you've got an epidemic of polio or COVID or measles or whatever it is, and you're going to put other kids at risk through no fault of their own, that's not your choice. That's a choice that impacts them. As we like to say in ethics, you can do what you want until, let's say, you can swing your arm as much as you like until it starts to hit somebody else's nose. At that point, your liberty is restricted because now you're harming somebody else. And we're used to that. You can't drive at any speed you want. We mandate speed limits. You can't go around. I'm saying, I'm hungry. I think I'll show up at Dr. Cohen's house and have dinner because I need food.
I don't cook, though. I make reservations.
Well, there you go. Maybe
you don't want to come to my house for food.
That choice of dinner target, but the principal thing, I can't go into anybody's house and get things I need to live, even if I'm desperate. Yeah. So it's the impact on third parties that's the basis for vaccination mandates. Abortion, I'm going to say, is a personal decision that the woman makes because it's only her body involved.
Right. No, I think this is all really good information. Thank you for sharing that. All right, let's move on to gun laws. This is like boom, boom, boom. Gun laws. Since, again, we had to, reschedule, again, more shootings. I think just a couple of fun facts. We now know there's been over 400, shootings since, 2022 began. We know there's been over 34 school shootings. We had Uvalde, but there's been so many more since that time. Yeah. It turns out now that the leading cause of death among U.S. children and adolescents is now gun injuries, whether it's suicide, homicide, unintentional, undetermined, or accidents. Mm-hmm. So it used to be car accidents. That used to be, every pediatrician's appointment definitely included seatbelts and don't text and drive and don't drink and drive and blah, blah, blah. Now we're talking, what do pediatricians tell them now? Amongst those things, right? Don't carry a gun, don't wield a gun, don't get into your parents' gun, whatever. I mean, it's unbelievable. So I just want to get your thoughts because it turns out that a lot of people don't even realize in 2004, the banned assault rifles, basically that was something that was banned until 2004 and then it expired. And so now that's why we have the allowance of assault rifles.
It worked. It worked.
Exactly.
The mass shootings went down. And when the thing expired, they exploded back up. Look, a lot of things to say here, but one, the whole notion that the Constitution gives you a right to carry around an AR-15 is ridiculous. I don't care how many lawyers claim that, that's the basis for the right to carry any weapon you want. A well-regulated militia of people carrying muskets is not the same as saying I have a right to go down to the mall with an AR-15 with no training, no screening of my mental stability, even if I have a record of crime, even if I'm under a restraining order from my spouse for being violent domestically. That notion is wrong. It is just patently wrong. Even all these originalists who are claiming they know what the Constitution meant. If you brought those people back from the convention in Philadelphia and said, well, we interpreted your comments about having a militia ready to fight foreign powers as giving us the right to carry automatic weapons with no training, testing, screening, nothing, I think they'd break into laughter. I mean, it's absurd. So, other comments. Okay, if you want guns, then could we at least do background checks? Could we at least disqualify people who have committed crimes or who are under restraining orders? Can we make sure that the minimum age to buy them is like 21? I mean, there are a lot of countries that have a lot of guns. Canada, Israel, you can think of Switzerland. But they train people, they test people, they screen people. You can't just go to a gun show and buy an automatic weapon. You have to undergo training and know how to store your gun and all that sort of thing. So I think that's the direction we should be moving in. And sadly, there's a reason we're not, and people don't want to say it, but I'll say it. The reason we have unregulated gun sales and rights is because some percentage of Americans believe that they need those weapons to fight the government that's coming to get them. It's got nothing to do with hunting or securing your house against criminals. It's got to do with this idea that the black helicopters are coming and the bureaucratic state is going to crush our freedom, and we better be armed and be ready to take on the government. We saw it at Charlottesville. We see it at many of these January 6th kinds of expressions. Gun rights are linked up to the ability to fight a revolution that some people believe in. Now that, by the way, is just silly, because you're not going to fight a revolution against the United States Army, even if they were wrong. It's this idea that a bunch of overweight fat guys, middle-aged guys, are going to fight off whatever this army is going to do to them.
With a pizza and a Coke,
I find this
big gulp. Yeah, no, I get
silly,
it. Yeah.
But that's really what we're talking about, and politicians won't say it. It's this, we have to be ready to rebel or hold out, or we're Afghanistan, we're going to battle against the forces of liberals or something, whoever they are.
Right. But that goes back, I guess, to the anger in the country, kind of, and social media. I mean, I guess you can't even separate the two of them. They go hand in hand. You can't have a lot of anger if you don't have enough to feed people anger. You have to feed it. Somehow there has to be an avenue, and that's been social media. So, deeper issues there, I guess, in terms of, how did we get here? But I guess the question is, will it spin back? Will it evolve back? Are you hopeful that the country will become less angry and less fearful and less of a need to grab guns and feel they need rights to protect those guns? Or do you feel like this is just a downhill slope? I mean,
yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure. A lot of the worry is about racism and immigration. So there are a lot of white people who worry that they're going to get displaced or overtaken by darker skinned people or people that have different religious cultural traditions, be they Korean or Middle Eastern or whatever, Asian, Indian Americans or whatever. The more that worries you, I think the more you get angry, the more many people sort of strike out. But as the demographic shift and the older generation passes on, I think younger people are a little better at being a little more eclectic or tolerant, or they just grow up that way and they're not freaking out about changes in our demographics. So in the long run, I think it'll quiet down. Short run, I don't know. The best proponent for getting things to quiet down is former President Trump, who is still managing to stumble his way toward making the opposition, if you will, to immigration and changes in demographics intolerable by being a guy who just won't stop blundering around. So he's weakening the, if you will, conservative opposition. He's got them split, and I think, he's doing damage.
Yeah, we're going to see how this plays out, because we're beginning, I said we're almost the end of 22. So there's some things ahead that we have to think about. Midterms in terms of who we vote for that support or, go along with our moral, bioethical and economic and, opinions. So that's going to be a big deal. I hope people do.
I'll make a prediction here. We'll see. You can get me back on in December or something to check it. But I think women who feel whatever they feel about abortion, they don't like being told that your autonomy is being rescinded.
Right.
I think those women are going to show up motivated to vote, and that bodes poorly, I think, for the pro-life positions that a lot of the GOP side of the street has taken. I do think it's not just whether they're a majority or not, it's who shows up. And I think those women, particularly career women in the burbs, around Philadelphia, around places like Kansas City. You look at that vote in Kansas on abortion, and I think it's a big signal about women are going to play a key role in the next election and in the next presidential election.
Yeah,
and I think that's good.
I think it's a great thing, and I will put in a plug from the doctor's side is that, I'm on different, huge boards of, Facebook and groups of women physicians. And, doctors are really not happy of how they're being treated. We saw that gynecologist that was just skewered. I mean, and she did everything right. And she had great medical judgment and her reputation just preceded her. And so the question is going to be are we going to be in states where doctors are leaving good gynecologists that are there.
I'm getting feedback that students won't go to medical school there, or won't do their residency there because they don't.
Which is only going to hurt more women.
Right.
And maybe if you're rich enough to fly away, you can do that. But most people can't, come up with those sums of money.
There are even some women who say to me, "I'm not going to college in a state where I don't have abortion as an option."
Yeah.
So here's another prediction. Yeah. Somewhere down the line, a doctor's going to get in trouble for trying to save the health of one of their patients by using abortion. They're going to put that doctor on trial. I think you're going to see strikes in hospitals, both in the state and outside, to support that doctor. The medical and nursing professions aren't just going to say, "Oh, well, you go ahead and prosecute Dr. Caplan because, he broke the law." They think the law is bad. They're not going to go, and doctors' strikes are hard. I mean, they put people at risk, but somehow or another, you're going to see political action from medicine. And remember, nursing, that's a huge number of people. Right. There are a lot of nurses in this country.
I think you're right, and I would hope so, because when I think about medical training, residency, med school, everything, the one thing about medicine that I will say, no matter what your religion, skin color, politics, we are all kind of in it. We are in it for the right reasons, or you don't go through that long struggle. And so it's one thing that really binds all, I think, men and women of all race, religion, skin color, is that it's to do no harm. And so that's where I think you're going to see the rallying. So I really hope
you heard me sneer before too. I am not interested in what the person in the state legislature with an extensive background as a pest exterminator or a used car dealer has to say about my healthcare with my doctor. I don't want them involved in that.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. Great point. Okay, let's move on to the FDA. A lot of things to talk about with the FDA if we want to. I don't know how much time you have for me, but I would love to just keep going. You let me know.
I got about 10 minutes.
Okay. Oh boy. Okay. So FDA, tell me a little bit about what you think of there's so much to talk about, but in terms of drugs pushed to market. We had an Alzheimer's drug not so long ago, pushed to market, raised a lot of eyebrows and a lot of voices. And it turned out that this was not a drug that actually would potentially be open to the public in large numbers. It was very expensive, could cause brain bleeds.
I don't think it worked.
Yeah, it didn't work. Maybe, so there was a whole host of things that, made us question, does the FDA really have its marbles together? I mean, where are we, and should we trust it? I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there have been some bad things, but a lot of good things. So I wanted to see what your thoughts are.
I'm an FDA defender.
Okay.
In principle, I think you need an agency that keeps an eye on new drugs, new medical devices, even new vaccines, and tries to insist that companies that bring them test them and provide evidence that they work and that they're safe. You can't just have a free market in that area. There occasionally an economist or two who just says, "Hey, let people buy whatever they want from whatever company they want, and caveat emptor, it's up to you to watch out." And come on. Nobody knows whether a new medicine is safe. Even doctors couldn't make that decision by themselves. You got to have evidence. You got to have somebody say, "These are the studies." Otherwise, you're just doing what I'm afraid we see something like this going on now, direct-to-consumer advertising on TV, which drives me insane. If I could change one thing, I'd get rid of that. The drug companies are whining that they can't make enough money these days, and they spend like $7 billion a year just on drug ads to consumers. And I'll come back to the FDA in a minute, but let me just say, if your doctor doesn't know about your cancer medicines and you have to watch TV and come in and ask about it, you need a new doctor. I mean, right away, because they ought to know what your diabetes medicine is without you saying, hey, I was watching the evening news and I saw this ad for Schmagekavaka, and do you think we could try that? I mean, what is that? It's completely ridiculous. Okay, now I feel better about that. The problem with the FDA is for years, pre-COVID, it was coming under pressure to speed up drug development. People were saying it's too slow. Europeans get drugs faster, which is false. They don't. But the pressure was on to say there's so many cures and so many things that are still in the lab or haven't been brought to market because it takes like 15 years from identifying something as possibly useful to final FDA approval, and people are dying of cancer or whatever is killing them, and we have all these cures. I don't believe any of that story. I think that adequate testing can be speeded up. I'm not saying that. But you ought to demand that the company that wants to charge you $100,000, $1 million a pill, prove that it works before you release it out into the public. So I don't think the FDA is losing its marbles. Congress, patient advocacy groups, they're pushing, and some lawyers and legislators, including, by the way, back when he was president, Donald Trump and Mike Pence, kept pushing the FDA to go faster, cut your standards, approve things more quickly. Then we get this Alzheimer's drug, the one you're talking about, Aduhelm, and it doesn't work, and the data stinks, and it has a zillion side effects, and it would have cost the entire budget of Medicare to give it out to older people. And we barely ducked a horrific mess. So I think you have to first stand up for an FDA. We need it. Second, say, well, do the studies, do them more efficiently, coordinate them, speed them up. We did it with vaccines, right? We had emergency use authorization. I'm not against that. That's fine. It's just speeding up.
That's the risk-benefit ratio. You have people dying. You have to speed things up to get it up.
Don't destroy the FDA. Don't eliminate it. Don't hamstring it so much that it's just toadying up to the next drug company claim.
Right.
I don't trust the drug companies. I don't trust the biotech companies. They have a big conflict of interest. They want to make money. I understand it, but it doesn't mean I should just rely on them to tell me what's a cure. So,
and you think the FDA is not in bed with the pharmaceutical companies? Let's clarify that.
There's a lot of revolving door. You work at the FDA for a while, you got to work for the pharmaceutical companies. They're friendly, let's put it that way.
But their argument, Gottlieb's argument was, listen, we know more, so we can contribute more. That's an interesting angle. I mean,
it is an angle, and the other angle is, I don't know if people realize this, but the FDA charges the pharmaceutical companies to do their studies. So the FDA doesn't even have a budget to be independent. It relies on the drug companies to fund them. What do I think? I think that's a little too cozy. That's what I think. Yeah, you do have expertise.
But it still needs to exist because we need some oversight, or else, you'll have thalidomide disasters with babies born with birth defects because they didn't test things. Or you're going to get marginal drugs that do a little bit of good that cost half the national budget to give out because no one's watching prices at the FDA. They're not assigned that job. So, I think you need them. Okay, so good thing. And last big topic, I know I'm squeezing you here, but environmental justice and climate change. We have a lot of, as we move forward, because, I'll be working on this and writing about this in the future as well as everyone else, I guess. But climate change as it pertains to environmental justice, water is going to be a scarce resource. We're seeing that now. You have, diseases like diabetes, which are on the rise. And then you have this need for insulin, which is a cold chain drug, meaning it requires refrigeration all the way through from manufacturing to get to the patients. And then you have this exploding. 40% of Americans are either pre-diabetic or diabetic. So, I guess this is sort of a catharsis. I feel like I need a drink, but I do, but any general thoughts on how environmental justice plays into the future of climate change? We're all in big trouble, I think, in many ways, but what are your thoughts?
Two comments. One, we need to understand that we do owe something to our children to make the world healthier, safer, better. Every religion recognizes that. Make your kids better off than you are. That's a commendable thing to do. If we leave the world a polluted, overheated mess, that's not doing what you owe your quote unquote children or our descendants. So I think there is a moral duty to do that for that reason. It's just like, I have a son. He's older now and way out in the world, but I tried to make his life better than mine. That was part of how I saw. I didn't just say, well, I have resources, I'm taking another vacation, and I think, hey, that Porsche Cayenne, I guess I'll buy that, and he can go screw himself with respect to college or whatever it is. You want to try and do better for the next generation. We owe it. So concede that. That's part of the moral foundation for climate protection or pollution or whatever. The other comment I'll make is this. I love medicine. Been a fan of medicine ever since I saw how it solved the polio problem way, way back in the day. But the biggest impacts on health are clean water, having climate under control so you can grow your food safety, food abundance. It's public health. It isn't really going to come by doing pig transplants. They're nice. I spend a lot of time thinking about them. But they impact a handful of people around the world. I mean, if we did 100 pig transplants last year, that's a lot. And the amount of writing about that is probably 10 times the amount thinking about what are you going to do about inadequate water infrastructure in the U.S. Forget about the world. So I'm in your camp with respect to that. I think the big gains in health have come from vaccines and public health, environmental safety, sanitation, better water. That's where you get the returns, and we've got to understand that we should be funding public health research and initiatives more broadly than we do. I love genetics. I love precision medicine. It's great to know what the genetic risk is of various diseases, but you want to make people better off, just make sure they have clean water. You'll get very far.
Right. Go back to the basics. I mean, we're now cycling back. Even the rich might have trouble get water. This is going to be a level the plains. When it comes to resources, we're all going to be in a pickle if we don't think broader.
Right. And again, you watch the Colorado River dry up. You see Las Vegas, Los Angeles.
Sure.
Huge parts of the country, Arizona, have no water. Well, that may seem inconvenient. It's a health disaster. I mean, just a health disaster. Plus, when people lose jobs, they don't have insurance, they can't pay for these are infrastructure things that drive huge outcomes in the health of people. And obviously worldwide, you just mentioned refrigeration. You need refrigeration for shots. You need refrigeration for medicine. You also need it for food. You can't refrigerate your food and ship it. Most of it rots. So that leads to malnutrition, health problems. So I think we got to start really taking this seriously. I think the med schools have to do better. They're still too focused on individual
disease
therapies,
treatment.
That's not the way to go.
And prevention and health prevention. I won't go on that, but really, if we're less sick, you won't need a lot of these things. So that's a whole nother topic for maybe I'll have you back on again after the midterms. Last question: what are your future projects? What are you working on? What do you want to share with the audience that maybe we can all take part in or take a look at?
Well, we are starting a big project on climate, environment, and health, trying to push into that space. We have an environmental studies department at NYU downtown, separate campus from the med school. We've never talked to them. Now we are. We're getting together. Good. We're going to look at simple things like temperature rise, heat, what's its impact on health, older people having no air conditioning, or you can look at the death rate there. We haven't saved as many lives at the NYU hospital as just died because of heat problems around.
And suicide rates and criminality and whether police make stops because it's too hot, or it's remarkable what a couple temperature degrees up can actually do in terms of behavior.
So we'll take a look at that. We're going to push out in that area. I think another big project area for us is we will watch the reproductive rights, abortion, and infertility treatment space. We've got a new project that we're launching there because I don't think the status quo is going to hold. So we're going to have to be ready to say, well, then if it isn't bans, then what is it? What do you want? Do you want women to have to talk to a committee if they want to end a pregnancy? Do you want to ban in vitro fertilization because of embryo destruction, which seems a little crazy to me? But we'll try and debate and talk about that. So we've got a bunch of working groups. We usually form 12, 15 people, heavily NYU, but oftentimes with others, and try to write reports, try to make legislative recommendations, really get in there and sort of throw ideas into the stew pot to see if something will hit. We also work with patient advocacy groups, so we want to take a look at pricing of new drugs, which is getting a little out of control there too. Too many $1 million gene therapies, too many $1 million pills. That's not viable into the future. So what is? Got to come up with an answer there. So still busy. Somebody jokingly said to me, so you're 72, Art, you must be getting ready for retirement. Well, not quite yet.
Yeah, I mean, do you play golf? Is that what you're going to spend your days doing?
No, I don't like golf. It's too boring.
Right. Yeah, so I always wonder about that. People who love their job generally look at retirement as something painful. So
yeah.
But anyway, so
no. But anyway, why should I stop working? I'm not going to shut up.
Yeah. Well, you got to find outlets for it. So I'll have you back on. You can be here every day if you want. So anything accessible by the audience that can look and see some of your opinions, or should they just go out and buy books? I mean, just tell us how we can hear more about what you're doing, what you're saying.
The easiest, cheapest way to keep tabs on me is just go to Twitter at Arthur Caplan. I put up a lot of articles. I'll tell you about new books. I'll tell you how to think about something. I'll tell you which politician of the day I don't like. So that's probably, follow me on Twitter, I would say, is the cheapest, easiest, simplest way to go.
Awesome. No, that's great, because that way you can lead us to other things to look at. So tell us one thing that we don't know about you, even though we learned a lot about you. I hear a dog in the back. So that dog you didn't see for 9 months back then, I'm assuming you're a lifelong dog lover now.
I have had collies ever since I had polio. The one you heard is a guest dog. There's a little schnauzer here today because my sister-in-law is visiting, and the two of them are... It's Mutt and Jeff, if anybody remembers that cartoon. My collie's big. This dog is, the visitor's small. They chase each other around. For dog lovers, they get the zoomies. They're hitting the backyard and running all over. So I'm a big collie dog fan. I'll tell you a funny last thing. Collies aren't as popular. Border collies, Shelties, they kind of took over the smaller versions of collies. There's really only 2 breeders in New England, New York, and New Jersey. I live in Ridgefield, Connecticut.
Okay.
The 2 breeders of collies are in Ridgefield, Connecticut. This dog comes up the street from the breeder.
That's great. And you know what? When people think about dog people, it frames them, I think, a little bit differently. If you're a pet lover.
I am a dog person. I think cat people are probably unethical.
I've got a cat. You better watch yourself. I'm going to edit that right out. Anyway, it's been an absolute pleasure. Such a thrill. I've been watching you for years, and I'm so thrilled that you made the time to be on this show and share with my audience. Thank you. And maybe we'll follow up in the future, but be well and, stay healthy as we move into the fall. It's great.
You too. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.